Why don't you want to go fishing with your father and Uncle John, Jacob? It'll be a lot of fun, Mrs. Walker asked, her frustration evident. She understood her husband didn't want Jacob cooped up in the house. The two men had planned a 3-day fishing trip at her brother's mountain cottage. Mom, I really don't want to go. There's so much I want to do here on the long weekend. Sighing, Mrs. Walker went back downstairs. Once Jacob locked himself in his room, she knew he was determined. She didn't think it was worth arguing further. I guess we'll go without him, Mr. Walker grumbled. He's becoming a real handful. Mrs. Walker watched them leave and worried about Jacob. It wasn't that he was misbehaving, quite the opposite. He was polite, helpful, and even a bit shy at school, but at home, he was vibrant. She shrugged and turned away from the window. You can come out now, Jacob. They've left. Jacob rushed to her, throwing his arms around her. I don't get you, Jacob. You usually love fishing with Dad. I do, but that's just for the morning. I love seeing the sunrise, but 3 days is too long. Don't you think so, Mom? Well, I guess not, Mrs. Walker said, her voice softening. Your father was disappointed. But come on, help me with breakfast, then we can wake your sister. We've got a lot to do. Jacob followed her, relieved. He knew he should have gone, but he preferred staying home to listen to music, read, or just daydream. As Mrs. Walker watched her 2 children chat at breakfast, she felt a deep sense of gratitude. They get along so well, so much better than many other siblings. After breakfast, Jacob went to the dining room, which had become the craft room. It was bright, cozy, and his favorite place to read. He had learned how to play records there, and now Mozart's music filled the space. Though he intended to read, he soon drifted into thought, staring absent-mindedly at a picture on the opposite wall. It was a doorway to his dream world, and even after all these years, it still captivated him. He knew every color, detail, and brushstroke. Lost in his thoughts, he didn't notice his mother and sister enter. They weren't paying attention to him either. Mrs. Walker was talking about redecorating the room. This room has become shabby over the years. Look at the wallpaper. Your dad and I did it before you were born, and now you're 10 and Jacob's 8. I don't know, Mom. I kind of like it the way it is, Emma replied. Jacob, still lost in his reverie, began to overhear their conversation about wallpaper and drapes. With this paper, the room would look so much more modern. I'll even get rid of that old picture and choose something fresher. Jacob's heart dropped. His eyes widened with fear as he leapt up, shouting, No. Not my picture. You can't throw it out. Both Mrs. Walker and Emma stared at him, shocked by the intensity of his reaction. But Jacob, it's just an old picture. We'll get something better, and you can help choose it. Mrs. Walker reassured him. Tears welled up in Jacob's eyes as he shook his mother's arm. Please, don't throw it out. I didn't know you liked it too, Emma said. Why can't we just keep it? Mrs. Walker saw the deep emotion in Jacob's eyes. She realized this picture meant more to him than she had imagined. She pulled him into a tight hug. Emma, darling, could you go make some tea? And bring the cookies from the jar. She gave Emma a small nod to hurry. Once Emma left, Mrs. Walker whispered to Jacob, Don't worry, I won't throw it away. I just didn't realize how much it meant to you. She held him close, rubbing his back, her eyes fixed on the picture. It depicted a mother and her 2 daughters having a picnic in a field of flowers, painted in a romantic, impressionist style. The mother wore a white dress, the older daughter a pale pink one, and the younger daughter a pale blue dress. The girls were arranging flowers around their mother's hat. Mrs. Walker thought, it really is a beautiful picture. But why was Jacob so upset? Mrs. Walker could sense that Jacob had calmed down. I like the picture too. Do you really love it? She asked as she gently held him to look into his eyes. Oh yes, I do, Jacob exclaimed with enthusiasm. Who do you think is the prettiest? She asked. I think they're all pretty, Jacob replied, sighing. I agree, said Emma, entering the room with tea and cookies. I've always admired that picture. I've often wished we could have a picnic like that. Aren't those dresses just dreamy? I've thought that too, Jacob said eagerly. Many times. All right, enough now, kids. It's settled, no throwing out the picture. If you're both good, and if I get everything done, we can have a picnic in Central Park on Monday. Now, let's enjoy our tea. As they drank tea, Jacob and Emma chatted excitedly about the picnic plans. The earlier excitement about the picture seemed to fade. Mrs. Walker sipped her tea slowly, her mind troubled by thoughts that had unexpectedly surfaced. She wished her husband were there. She made up her mind to talk to Rachel, her sister-in-law, who she knew could offer some guidance. Mrs. Walker picked up the phone and dialed Rachel's number. Who are you calling, Mom? Emma asked. Aunt Rachel. Now, quiet, please. After a brief conversation, Mrs. Walker hung up. She'll be here in an hour. Later, when Rachel arrived and the kids were settled in the den, Mrs. Walker began, It's about Jacob, Rachel. I don't know how to explain. Is he sick? Rachel asked, concerned. Wasn't he supposed to go fishing with the guys? Yes, that's part of it. You know, you're a psychiatrist. If I'm being silly, you'll tell me, right? Of course, Anne. You know, I'll be honest with you. What's going on? Mrs. Walker explained how her husband had grown increasingly concerned that Jacob was becoming too domesticated for a boy. At first, she dismissed it because Jacob seemed so happy. Then, she recounted the incident with the picture earlier that morning. I know the picture well. I've always liked it too. But why does it bother you so much? Rachel asked, curious. It's not just about not wanting me to throw out the picture, it was his picture, and he was really upset. I've never seen him like that before, Mrs. Walker said. Then, while I held him, trying to comfort him, I looked at the picture, trying to understand, and then it hit me. Mrs. Walker paused, unsure whether she was just imagining things. What hit you, Anne? I wonder if he imagined he was one of the girls in the picture, she asked, her voice shaky. Rachel thought for a moment. And, is that all? It's totally possible. We all imagine things like that as kids. I used to picture myself as a princess. It's nothing to worry about. No, Rachel. I feel like there's more to it. It's hard to explain, but when I looked at that picture, so many things I had forgotten came rushing back. How proud he is when he bakes gingerbread men, how much he enjoys fastening my necklaces, how he and Emma play like sisters, how he doesn't make friends with the boys at school. I just know there's more to it, and I'm so worried. Rachel, knowing and to be a sensible person, was careful with her response. Jacob seems like a happy child, and there's no obvious mental strain. Even if your worries turn out to be true, there's no immediate need to act. I'm not a child psychiatrist, but I can refer you to a colleague who specializes in children. She's excellent, you'll like her. In the meantime, don't stress over it too much. Thanks, Rachel. I feel a bit better. I just kept thinking I was the one who caused this. I should have made him play with the boys more. No, and that would have been the worst thing you could do. It would have caused him stress. He clearly trusts and loves you. Why don't you try talking to him directly, at the right moment, of course. You'll know when. Ask him how he really feels about the picture. As Mrs. Walker drove home, she couldn't shake Anne's advice from her mind. More incidents about Jacob started to resurface, and she began to see him almost as a different person. But rather than feeling shocked or troubled, she found that she loved him even more. "Wait, I'm being silly," she muttered to herself. "We don't know anything for sure yet. I shouldn't jump to conclusions." "What's wrong, Mom?" Jacob asked from the front seat. "Nothing, dear," Mrs. Walker smiled. "Just thinking out loud. I must be getting old." "Mom!" Jacob groaned playfully. "Just kidding, kiddo. We stayed at Aunt Rachel's a long time. We'll make it home just in time for supper. What should we have for dinner?" "Something quick?" "Mac and cheese," the kids shouted in unison. Mrs. Walker smiled. She could have predicted that. It was their favorite. No matter what the future held, she loved her kids. "It's late, kids, time for bed," Mrs. Walker said, glancing at her watch. "It's been a long day for all of us. Don't forget to brush your teeth, I'll tuck you in soon." She wondered how many times she had said those words. Rachel's suggestion kept circling in her mind. Was it the right thing to do? Would she hurt him? What if she gave him the wrong idea? She shrugged it off. It can wait, she thought. After checking the doors and lights, Mrs. Walker retired to her room. But sleep didn't come easily. The events of the day replayed in her mind. Why did this have to happen? Everything was perfect before. But nothing's changed, everything is the same. Maybe I'm just overthinking it. Jim's the one who put these thoughts in my head. Eventually, she drifted into a restless sleep. Suddenly, she awoke with a jolt. The room was bathed in bright light. I must still be dreaming, she thought, feeling confused. "Wake up, Mom! We've brought you breakfast," Emma called out. As her eyes adjusted to the light, Mrs. Walker saw Emma and Jacob standing beside the bed, each carrying a tray. "You said you had a lot to do, and it's already past 9, Emma explained. "I've got eggs and toast, and Jacob's got the tea." "You're such sweethearts." Mrs. Walker smiled as she sat up. "I couldn't sleep last night, so I overslept." "Thank you so much." "Have you eaten?" "Oh, yes." "What are we doing today, Mom?" Jacob asked eagerly. "I'm not sure," Mrs. Walker replied, buttering her toast. "We stayed so long at Aunt Rachel's yesterday. We won't finish redecorating the room before the guys come back from their fishing trip." "And what are you two giggling about?" "We're not giggling, Mom," Emma protested, only making them giggle more. "That's exactly what we hoped you'd say," Jacob admitted, still laughing. "We like the room just the way it is. I love it when we're working in there, with fabric and patterns everywhere. It's way more fun than the stuffy pictures in your decorating magazines." "Yes, we've had some great times in there, haven't we?" Mrs. Walker agreed, sipping her tea. She thought again about the picture from the day before. "I just have to know." "Jacob, why were you so upset about the picture yesterday?" she asked. Jacob stiffened and blushed deeply. I don't know, Mom. I've just always liked it." Seeing Jacob's reaction, Mrs. Walker knew her suspicions were right. She took his hand in hers, looked into his eyes, and gently said, "You imagined you were the girl in the blue dress, didn't you?" "Yes, Mom," Jacob replied, his voice breaking as tears welled up in his eyes. "It's okay, Jacob," Mrs. Walker reassured him, ruffling his hair. "You should have told me earlier, you silly Billy. We don't keep secrets from each other, remember?" Emma grabbed Jacob's hands and started spinning him around the room, both of them laughing until they were out of breath. "I've always thought it would be so nice to live in those times and go on picnics like that," Emma said, grinning. Mrs. Walker wrapped her arms around both of her children. "How about this?" she suggested. "Let's go into town this morning to find some fabric. Then we can make dresses just like the ones in the picture and wear them for our picnic." Yippee, both kids cheered. Thank you, Mom. All right, go get ready. We have a lot to do before tomorrow. Once the kids had gone, Mrs. Walker sat back down on her bed. What have I started, she wondered. How am I going to tell James? Things will never be the same. She picked up the phone and dialed Rachel. Hi, Rachel. Yes, everything's fine. Listen, I'm taking the kids on a picnic tomorrow afternoon at Central Park. Can you come too? But be ready for a big surprise. No, I can't tell you yet. Yes, I'm excited. We'll pick you up at 3 tomorrow. Bye.